This is TLC Elementary School, a place where teachers can find high-quality documentary programs created to inform and delight students. Use TLC Elementary School to complement your classroom lessons and to give students an up-close look at the world and the people around them.
On this edition of TLC Elementary School, explore the Before watching Caribbean lands and cultures, think about this. What do you think were the political and economic motives for Europeans who colonized many of the Caribbean islands?
In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed west from Spain in search of India. In his daring venture across the Atlantic Ocean, he and his sailors came upon the islands of the Caribbean that stretch more than 2,000 miles from the tip of Florida to the coast of Venezuela. He called them the Indies. Columbus was the first European to discover these islands, but people had been living here for centuries. These islands separate the Caribbean Sea from the Atlantic Ocean, and today they are called the West Indies. The Spanish were the first to colonize and farm in the West Indies. They colonized the majority of the islands, bringing Africans to work as slaves in the fields. Then England, France, and the Netherlands realized the significance of the lush vegetation of these islands. Soon, the Europeans had turned the fertile soils into coffee and tobacco plantations. Over the next few hundred years, the islands gained their independence, but the Spanish and African influence can still be seen everywhere throughout the islands today. Each island has its own character and culture, but they all share many of the same physical features. They all have the same hot tropical climate for most of the year. They withstand fierce hurricanes that batter the shoreline every summer and fall. The vegetation is mostly tropical rainforest on these islands, but some, like Cuba, also have temperate grasslands. Sugarcane, coffee, bananas, and other crops are growing on most of the islands. These products are some of the main exports of the Caribbean. Tourism is another major industry in the Caribbean. Cruise ships are a common sight in these waters. The larger islands, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, Cuba, and Hispaniola, are actually the exposed tops of underwater mountains. Millions of years ago, they were part of a mountain chain that linked North and South America. Other islands were formed by volcanic eruptions. Two tectonic plates that form the Earth's crust meet in the West Indies. Over the years, as the plates shifted and collided, volcanoes erupted, and these volcanoes are responsible for creating the islands of the Caribbean. In fact, several volcanoes are still active on these islands. The Bahamas and smaller island chains are coral islands. They formed from the buildup of the skeletons of tiny sea animals called coral. Over millions of years, this buildup created islands. You'll find a diversity of ethnic backgrounds in the Caribbean islands. A long history of colonization has given these islands a mix of cultures and races. The Spanish, French, and English brought their languages and cultures. These traditions blended with those of the Africans and indigenous peoples to create the rich cultures of the islands today. The island nations of the Caribbean may be some of the smallest countries in the world, but they are the main destination for the millions of tourists who visit and are home to the people who live here. The bounty of natural resources on these islands first encouraged colonization that eventually spread throughout the Western Hemisphere. Today, the influence of Caribbean culture, like music, dance, and food, can be found throughout North and South America.
Segment 2. Baseball and Cuba go hand in glove. Before watching baseball and Cuba go hand in glove, think about this. How did baseball come to the island of Cuba?
Have you ever played on a sports team or cheered for one? Throughout Latin America, soccer is one of the most popular sports, and it's an important part of the culture. In Cuba, fans take sports seriously, but it's most likely not a soccer team they're cheering for. Cubans are passionate about baseball. Just 92 nautical miles south of Miami, Florida, Cuba stretches about 780 miles from east to west. It is the largest island in the Caribbean. Although politically different, the United States and Cuba are close geographically, and they share many favorite pastimes, especially baseball. Cubans grow up playing baseball. They play informal games in the streets, and many kids dream of becoming professional ball players. And just like American fans of the game, Cubans love to cheer and argue about which team is best. To understand the importance of baseball to Cuban culture, it's important to know some of Cuba's history. Between 1868 and 1899, the Cubans struggled for independence from Spain. Cuba finally gained independence on May 20th, 1902. After the war, dictators controlled Cuba for many years. In 1959, Fidel Castro and his band of communist revolutionaries overthrew the government. Since then, Cuba has been a communist country. Throughout years of political turmoil, baseball has remained a major part of the country's culture. Cuba has some of the best players in the world. Historians disagree on how the game developed in Cuba. Some say the island's indigenous people played a game similar to baseball. Other historians say that Cubans studying in the United States in the late 1800s brought the game back to Cuba. Either way, it is clear that love for baseball brings Cubans together, even if they cheer for different teams. Many Cubans have fled by boat to the United States in search of freedom. And some of these are Cuban baseball players who have defected, leaving Cuba for good to live in the United States and play baseball on professional teams. They cannot return to Cuba. For Americans and Cubans alike, love of baseball is a shared feeling. When the players are on the field, the rules are the same and the desire to win is equal.
Segment 4. The Caribbean's musical mix. Before watching the Caribbean's musical mix, think about this. What sounds come to mind when you think of the music of the Caribbean?
Music is as much a part of the atmosphere in the Caribbean as the warm sun and ocean breezes. Festive and easy to dance to, the Caribbean beat is recognized around the world. Of course, there are as many different styles of music here as there are islands. Travel to Puerto Rico, for example, and you'll hear the heavy rhythm of the bomba drums. Enslaved Africans were shipped here beginning in the 1500s. They brought with them a folk dance dominated by drums and call and response vocals, in which the leader sings a line and the group answers. Bomba is the purest form of that tradition surviving today. The basic steps are fairly simple, but in practice the dance becomes a spirited art form. In fact, bomba is more than a dance. It's an ever-changing conversation. Drummers sit in a line playing two different types of drums. The larger drum, called the boleador, keeps the beat. The smaller drum, called the subidor, changes rhythm and responds to the movements of dancers, both trying to mimic and encourage the dancers. The music that finally develops depends on the mood of the drummers and dancers. The Dominican Republic, on the island of Hispaniola, is the birthplace of another popular Latin dance, merengue. Once considered music of the common people, merengue has become a vital part of the Dominican Republic's cultural identity. There's even a national merengue festival held every July. More than 10 days of singing and dancing in the streets. The festival draws people from around the world, including the well-known merengue singer, Sergio Vargas, who grew up here. Like almost all modern Caribbean music, merengue combines elements from both African and Western traditions.
I guess that mixture of things, you know, is what makes the merengue. It's basically an African rhythm, you know, but then it has the melody and the music from Spanish songs.
It was a dictator named Rafael Trujillo who came from peasant roots, who adopted the dance as a national symbol. Today, the merengue is distinguished by the use of three signature instruments: the tambora, the saxophone, and the accordion. The tambora is a two-headed drum, laid across the lap and played with a stick in the right hand and an empty left hand. During a song, the tambora sets the rhythm and the saxophone and accordion respond. This combination of beats gives the merengue its characteristic drive that some have called the pulse of the nation. The Caribbean's largest country, Cuba, has produced artists of immense talent, some of whom have only recently been discovered. One of those is Israel Lopez, also known as Cachao. Cachao, a great musician even as a child, played bass with the Havana Philharmonic Orchestra at the age of 12. Along with his gift for performing, Cachao had the genius of an inventor.
I was in the bathroom and I heard this dripping noise. I wrote it down. I can get a melody out of that. I can come up with a melody out of any noise.
In the 1930s, Cachao and his brother, Orestes, decided to inject some life into the slow, European-inspired ballroom dancing popular at the time. They sped it up and jazzed it up, and the result was called mambo.
It was a new thing, and that's why it took people by surprise. That's why we were out of work for 6 months, because people didn't understand it. We were ahead of our time, my brother and I.
By the 1940s and 50s, mambo had become a sensation. The upbeat rhythms and dance steps made it popular around the world. Like American jazz, mambo relies heavily on improvisation, making it up as you go along. While often played by an orchestra, the main instruments are usually the flute and the piano. One of the musical styles most often identified with the Caribbean today is calypso. This is in large part because calypso has become so closely associated with the Caribbean's most distinctive musical instrument, the steel drum. The steel drum, or steel pan, is one of the newest musical instruments in the world, invented in the 1930s at the earliest. Stories of its origins vary, but they all begin in Trinidad. In the best-known story, some local percussionists discovered they could get an unusual sound out of empty oil drums discarded by Navy bases on the island. They pounded and shaped the steel containers, creating different sounds from different shapes. Steel drums, with their distinct sound, have become a symbol for not only Trinidad, but also for the rest of the Caribbean.